I first noticed the man on a brisk autumn afternoon. At the time, my family and I had just relocated from Brooklyn to a secluded house nestled in the Connecticut woods. My father had secured a new job that required us to trade the chaos of city life for the eerie quiet of the countryside. My mother, only 27, was enamored with the scenery, but even her admiration of the natural beauty couldn't suppress the growing unease that would soon plague our lives. I was 5 years old, and my memories from that time are fragmented, but the fear etched into my mother's face remains vivid. It began with fleeting glimpses. She would spot him at the grocery store, leaning against shelves with an unsettling smile. She'd see him at the park, seated on a bench, eyes fixed on her as my sister and I played. At first, my father dismissed her worries, reasoning that in a small town, familiar faces often reappeared. But my mother's instincts screamed otherwise. Her paranoia thickened like the fog that rolled in during early mornings. It came to a head one afternoon. She was leaving the house to pick up my sister from nursery school when she noticed a car idling through the trees near our driveway. As she pulled out, the vehicle followed. Fear twisted her stomach, but she continued to the school, hoping she was imagining things. After collecting my sister, she emerged to find the man standing by his car, sunglasses obscuring his eyes but failing to hide his intent. Fueled by panic and her Brooklyn grit, my mother unleashed a barrage of threats, shouting at him until he fled. That night, my father finally took her fears seriously. The police were called, and they quickly identified the man. He had a record, a pattern of following women, but was dismissed as harmless and simple-minded. Despite my mother's protests, the authorities merely warned him and his parents, who lived nearby, to leave us alone. They assured us it was handled. My father, ever trusting, let it go. Months passed, and the man seemed to disappear. My father occasionally drove past his house, confirming his car was there. My mother, though still on edge, began to relax. We all did. Until the night that changed everything. It was the summer of 1987. The heat lingered even after the sun dipped below the horizon. I was in bed but restless, listening to the muffled hum of the television in the living room. My sister's sudden gasping cries shattered the calm. She was having an asthma attack, her tiny body racked with panic as she struggled to breathe. My parents erupted into action, my father calling 911 while my mother ushered my sister into the bathroom to inhale steam from a running shower. I stood in the hallway, frozen by the chaos. I wanted to help but didn't know how. I decided to look for my dad, thinking he'd be in the kitchen where the phone was. As I stepped toward the den, something caught my eye at the staircase leading to the front door. A man stood at the bottom, the door wide open behind him. At first, I thought it was the police, arriving impossibly fast. I called out to my parents, announcing their arrival. But when my mother joined me and saw him, she screamed, a sound so raw and primal it made my blood run cold. It wasn't a police officer. It was him. The stalker stood there, staring up at us with eyes that betrayed no fear. My father appeared just as my mother shrieked, her voice trembling as she identified the intruder. The look on my father's face, caught between protecting his gasping daughter and confronting this predator, will haunt me forever. The man bolted, disappearing into the night. My dad didn't give chase. He knew where the man lived and, with my sister still struggling to breathe, prioritized getting her the help she needed. Moments later, the Real police arrived, their faces etched with confusion as my mom frantically explained what had just happened. Within minutes, EMTs stabilized my sister, but the house remained thick with tension. Officers scoured the area, eventually spotting the man running along the road. When they caught him, he confessed to watching my mother through the windows for months, convinced that he could be her savior. He was arrested and later pled guilty to trespassing and stalking. Although he served time, the lack of physical violence kept the case relatively quiet. My parents moved us back to Brooklyn by fall. The fear lingered, however, leaving cracks in our sense of safety that would never fully mend. Years later, we learned he had died of a heart attack after living in a group home post-incarceration. My mother can now tell the story with a nervous laugh, but I know the scars of that night run deeper than she admits. And so, the woods of Connecticut became a memory, a place where shadows danced too closely and monsters wore familiar faces. The move back to Brooklyn offered a reprieve, but the shadows of Connecticut trailed us like ghosts. My mother still flinched at unexpected knocks on the door, and my father's eyes lingered longer than necessary on passing strangers. As for me, nightmares took root, dreams of dark figures lurking in windows and footsteps echoing through the night. Our new apartment was smaller, noisier, and far removed from the isolation we had left behind, but it offered safety in numbers. The walls were thin, the streets busy, and the anonymity of city life allowed us to blend in. Yet even as we tried to settle, the weight of that night clung to us. I remember overhearing hushed conversations between my parents. My father admitted he felt guilty, that he should have acted sooner, should have done more. My mother's voice, sharp and brittle, would break in, reminding him that she had tried to warn him, tried to warn everyone. But neither of them could change the past, and so their guilt simmered beneath the surface. For me, the memories sharpened as I grew older. I couldn't stop picturing the man's face at the bottom of the stairs, the way he looked at me as if he belonged there, as if I was the intruder and not him. I began to wonder what might have happened if my sister's asthma attack hadn't drawn my parents' attention. Would he have come inside? Would he have hurt us? The questions festered, feeding my imagination. At night, I would replay the scene, inserting darker twists and endings. Sometimes I pictured him stepping closer, his shadow stretching up the stairs. Other times, I imagined him lunging toward my mother or grabbing me before my father could stop him. The uncertainty made it worse. We would never truly know what he intended. Years passed, and while my parents learned to laugh nervously about the incident, I became fixated on understanding him. I scoured libraries for articles on stalking and obsessed over criminal psychology books. The more I learned, the less comforted I felt. I discovered that stalkers often escalated, their obsession feeding on perceived connections and imagined relationships. The police had described him as harmless, but was he? He had broken into our home. He had watched my mother for months, memorizing her habits. In his mind, he had convinced himself he was saving her. That kind of delusion didn't vanish overnight. By the time I was a teenager, I began to research him more directly. I asked my parents about his name, combed through old newspapers, and even made inquiries at the police station under the guise of a school project. Most of the information had been lost to time, but I did uncover a few chilling details. The man had been a local oddity long before he fixated on my family. Neighbors whispered about his strange habits, how he'd linger around playgrounds or wander the streets late at night. Some described him as quiet and shy, while others admitted they found him deeply unsettling. No one seemed to know much about his past, only that he lived with his parents and rarely spoke to anyone. When I learned that he had died in a group home, I felt relief, but also something darker. I wondered if he had died alone, still dreaming of my mother, still imagining himself as her protector. Did he regret what he had done? Or did he die believing he had been wronged? The fear he left behind didn't die with him. It lingered in my mother's wary glances and my father's double-checking of locks. It shaped the way I viewed strangers, making me quick to judge and slow to trust. And even now, as I write this, I can't help but glance at the door, half expecting to see someone staring back. The woods of Connecticut may have faded into memory, but their shadows remain, stretching far beyond the trees. The years that followed were quieter, but the past never fully loosened its grip. I grew up hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly scanning faces in crowds and feeling a faint prickle of unease in darkened rooms. My parents did their best to create a normal life for us, but there was always an edge to their smiles, a tension that surfaced and the phone rang unexpectedly or a stranger lingered too long outside our building. As I grew older, my obsession with understanding what happened only deepened. I tracked down more records about the man who had stalked us. His name was Michael Hale. I found it listed in old court documents and newspaper archives. He had been released from jail after serving just 2 years and was moved to a halfway house before being transferred to the group home where he died. The official reports described him as mentally ill but non-violent. What struck me most was how thin the official record was, just fragments of his life, like scraps of paper scattered by the wind. No one seemed to care about his story. To most people, he was an afterthought, a footnote in a police report. But to me, he had been a living nightmare. I tracked down one of the officers who had responded that night. He was retired by then, but he remembered the case. He was just a messed up kid, the officer said. Didn't know how to handle the world. I don't think he meant harm. I wanted to scream at him. How could he say that? Harm didn't always come from violence. Sometimes it came from the fear someone left behind. Michael Hale had broken into our home, stalked my mother, and watched us through the windows like prey. That wasn't harmless. But the officer wasn't interested in what I had to say. To him, it was just another closed case. Over time, I tried to put it behind me. I moved out of my parents' apartment and started a life of my own. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael Hale wasn't truly gone. I saw glimpses of him everywhere, a man leaning against a lamppost, a shadow in an alley, a stranger crossing the street. Rationally, I knew it couldn't be him, but the fear refused to die. One evening, not long after I moved into my first apartment, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. They stopped in front of my unit and lingered there. My heart pounded as I crept to the peephole and looked out. No one was there. But I couldn't sleep that night. I kept picturing the moment when I had seen Michael Hale standing in my childhood home, staring up at me from the bottom of the stairs. I realized then that his shadow would follow me forever, no matter how far I ran. It wasn't until years later that I finally visited his grave. It was in a small cemetery on the outskirts of the town where it all began. The headstone was simple, weathered by time, and bore only his name and the years of his birth and death. No epitaph, no words of remembrance. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what I felt. Pity? Hatred? Relief? In the end, it was none of those things. It was just emptiness. Michael Hale had died as he had lived, a shadow on the edge of other people's lives. When I walked away, I didn't look back. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that some part of him was still watching. Maybe it always would be. And maybe that was the scariest part of all.